Now we're going to start the last mini lecture for chapter 10. So we left off talking about crop adaptation and why that is important. So we look at three main adaptation types in terms of climate, and those three are temperate, tropical, and subtropical. So for example, when we look at temperate, we're looking at those seasons, those regions that have a seasonal change in temperatures, and those are more drastic than tropical or subtropical. And we grow different aspects of crops like alfalfa, wheat, and barley are just some examples of that. And then we have tropical or subtropical climates that are closer to the equator or are originated closer to the equator or the border of those tropical temperatures. Corn and soybeans are good examples of those. So crop variations are another important aspect of that. So within that crop variation, we have some species and varieties within that crop species that will then vary within their temperature tolerance. So for example, winter wheat that we seed in or we drill into in the fall has a much better tolerance to the cold than spring wheat. So we can plant that wheat in as late as November, and it can take that cold weather that we might have in the four-state area. Alfalfa is a good one. It has a really good winter hardiness, and then corn hybrids we've bred so that maturity will then start to happen. That growth will start to happen after the frost-free or the frost days have then come and gone, so we don't have to worry about that in some cases. I mean, if you're planting at a different time, that's not where it should be. But because we have crop variation, it's easy for us to find different crops that will grow well, not just within our soil and our environment, but with our climate as well. So moisture stress, we talked a little bit about this just a little bit ago, but there's just a couple, three main points that I want to go over in terms of how it's adapted to the different types of climate. So hydrophytes, mesophytes, and then xerophytes. Hydrophytes, they're plants that are grown in water. Rice is a really good example of it because we have to flood that rice field to make that rice grow. Mesophytes, good example are corn, alfalfa, soybean varieties, because it's going to depend on that rain for different development and growth. And then our last one, we're looking at the very dry environment. So cacti is a really good example, or anything that can grow field-wise in very dry conditions would be a good example of that. So some cultural practices that we'll go over this week in class that's really important in terms of management. We have crop residue following, irrigation, drainage, and then planting dates. So the main ones that I'm going to focus on in this lecture, this last mini lecture, is drainage and planting dates and rates. And so obviously drainage is just that removal of all that excess water that we might have on that field, and then planting dates, and then the rates that we might have within that plant, or within that seed bed. So irrigation, two different types that we'll look at. We'll look at surface irrigation in class, and then we'll look at sprinkler irrigation. Those surface types, that's just when water is applied directly to that soil surface. So we can either flood it, we can furrow it, and then it's going to have a different land level or a grade to that to make sure it's uniform in that flooding, and then draining that excess off so it's not being that seed or that plant is not being waterlogged. And then sprinkler irrigation, which is becoming more popular, we're going to use a different, like a air that has a pipe through it, and it's going to have sprinklers and what you might think what a sprinkler irrigation will look like. Way more efficient than surface irrigation because you're going to be able to manage how much is going really to the foot of every single part of that field. So this is what the irrigation systems that are used within the United States. Just a pie graph for you. Center pivot, you can see about 41%. That's the most popular, a little bit more expensive than all of the other types of irrigation that we have. But if it's being used with the correct amount of land, it can definitely pay itself off within the correct number of years. Uncontrolled We have the border of the basin, which, not very many people are at a border or a basin. We have a furrow, which is that surface irrigation that we talked about. It's about 22%. Sprinkler irrigation about 9%, and then just different other irrigation systems that are coming out that are obviously important as well. So you can see here that we have on the left a level basin flood irrigation. So this is a rice field, and they're just going to flood it, and that's how that rice will then start to grow and develop within that basin. So pretty cool on that left hand side, and then the right hand side. This is where a lot of those jokes about crop circles will come about, because some people that might not understand agriculture and the way we grow plants or what even a center pivot is, they could definitely see that as a crop quote unquote circle. But that center pivot is going to make a complete circle and be able to irrigate a lot more acres than some other types of irrigation systems. So some strategies when you're looking at irrigation. Crops definitely have to be met without overlapping water, because if that happens, there's going to be some waterlogging issues. There's going to be some stress because there's too much water. And then that's just kind of throwing that seed away, which is not good. Definitely have to have a measurement of that soil and that moisture status, and really have to understand the estimation of what that crop needs to use. So, you're definitely going to have to understand what your weather is going to be that day, especially that week, what your climate is going to look like for the next 60 to 90 days, and how that's going to interact with how much water you're putting on that ground. So then drainage of cropland. So just taking off that excess water in that soil or in that field, and that could be hard if there's not any sort of slope to that field. So you're gonna have to remove it in manually with different machines, and so this can be done either surface or by subsurface systems. I'll show you a picture of a subsurface system in just a minute, and then artificial drainage is obviously important and has really increased in popularity the last 30 years probably, because it can be successfully farmed and drained at the same time. So here's an example of what drainage tile looks like. This is a perforated drainage tile. So you can see if we are going to irrigate this corn, we don't want that excess moisture going into those root systems all at once, especially if it's 4 weeks, because it will waterlog them and then that crop will die. So it will go down into this drainage pipe, and then it will go to some sort of ditch or some sort of water system that won't be intaken by humans. So how do we manage all of this? How do we manage how much water we're going to be able to put into this crop and utilize it to its best efficiency? Planting dates is really important when you're looking at all of this, especially if you're going to irrigate. But unfortunately, we are not Mother Nature, and we can't say, when it's going to rain, when it's not going to rain, if we're going to have a flood this year, if we're going to have a drought for the next 2 years. So planting dates are really important, especially in terms of how, some frost stress or even some heat stress later in the summer. So planting dates are really important. And that kind of seems to be all over the board in this part of the country. Some people will plant really early, like early March. Some people will plant and they'll wait to plant corn the first week of May. So that's just kind of up to you, and that's the decision that you're going to have to make as that agriculturalist. And then planting population. So how many seeds you're planting per foot or per yard or per acre, how much seed you're actually putting in the ground, so that the sun can give you that optimum light interception. Soil moisture is going to be where it needs to be, and then it's going to be able to grow and develop throughout that season of growth. And then one big aspect that we have to look at is the control of weeds, and how it's going to be essential to remove competitors from that field. So Johnson grass is a great example. Pigweed is a great example. We see a lot of those types of weeds in our fields, and it's competition for our corn or our soybeans or our milo, whatever we're growing, for the light, the water, and the nutrients. And that's something that is really important to to focus on. And if you're going to farm if you're going to be able to spray, or if you're going to be able to throw down herbicide, that's something that you have to take into consideration too when you're looking at that crop management.